First, they smiled for the cameras. They held hands at premieres and whispered sweet nothings to reporters who swallowed every word like it was scripture. America believed them, and America needed to believe them, because in a country still healing from war and still learning what peacetime prosperity actually felt like, Hollywood's golden couples weren't just famous faces. They were evidence that love was real, that happiness could be photographed, that the fairy tales playing out on screen had some breathing counterpart in actual life. But here's the thing about fairy tales. Someone always writes them. And in Hollywood's golden age, that someone wasn't Cupid sitting in the California sunshine. It was a studio executive behind a mahogany desk, running the numbers on what a well-timed wedding announcement might do for a film's opening weekend. What you're about to hear isn't dressed-up gossip or rumor-wearing rhinestones. This is the hidden machinery of an entire era. The cold, calculated infrastructure running beneath the glamour and the champagne and the carefully lit publicity photographs. And the man who allegedly knew most of it, who had quietly cataloged it over decades of private conversations with Hollywood's most powerful insiders, was the greatest late-night host who ever lived. Johnny Carson had spent 30 years sitting across from the biggest names in entertainment, watching them perform their public selves with breathtaking precision. And in the quiet hours after the first lights went down, some of them apparently told him things they told almost nobody else. What Carson reportedly compiled across those private conversations was nothing short of a secret history of Hollywood's most celebrated marriages, 10 unions that weren't love stories, 10 arrangements that were business deals wearing wedding lace, 10 performances that deceived an entire nation for decades, and some of those secrets traveled all the way to the grave before anyone finally said them out loud. To understand why any of this happened, you first need to understand what Hollywood actually was during its golden age. And what it was had very little to do with art or romance. Studios didn't just produce films. They manufactured myths, and the product being built was desire itself. Executives decided what a star wore, what they said in interviews, who they were photographed with, and who they married. A star's personal life wasn't personal in any meaningful sense of the word. It was inventory. It was an extension of the studio's brand, managed with the same efficiency a factory manager might bring to a production line. And when a star's authentic life, their actual sexuality, their real relationships, their genuine personality, threatened the image the studio had constructed and was profiting from, executives moved quickly. The solution they reached for most often was breathtaking in its cynicism. Marriage, a documented, photographed, fan magazine-approved marriage to someone, carefully selected to neutralize whatever the real life posed as a threat. Some called these arrangements lavender marriages. Others used more clinical language. But everyone inside the system understood exactly what they were. Performances. Contracts wearing the clothes of commitments. And the people inside them paid prices no contract ever bothered to account for. Rock Hudson embodied the American ideal of masculine perfection so completely that women across the country wrote him letters describing feelings they could barely put into words, and all of it rested on a foundation of complete fiction. Hudson was gay, and by 1955, the whispers about his sexuality had grown loud enough to alarm everyone who profited from his image. His agent, Henry Wilson, understood the threat and addressed it with the precision of a military operation, which is almost exactly how a former Universal Pictures executive later described what followed. The solution Wilson reached for was already sitting in his own office, his secretary, Phyllis Gates. Within months of Wilson deciding that Hudson needed a wife, the two were engaged, and fan magazines covered every detail of the romance with breathless enthusiasm. America's most eligible bachelor was suddenly wonderfully spoken for, and the photographs were everything they needed to be. What remained bitterly contested for decades afterward was whether Gates understood the role she was playing. Her 1987 memoir painted her as a genuine victim who had fallen in love and been devastated by the discovery of the truth, but Hollywood insiders told a different story, and Carson apparently had little patience for her account. According to a former Tonight Show writer, Carson said flatly that everyone in Hollywood knew what rock was, and the only explanation for Gates not knowing was that she had made a deliberate choice not to look too closely. 3 years after it began, the marriage ended, with divorce papers citing mental cruelty, language vague enough to protect Hudson's image entirely. Hudson went on performing his double life for another 3 decades, until his death from AIDS in 1985 finally told the truth to a nation that had never been allowed to hear it. Carson's alleged description of the whole arrangement became one of his most quoted private observations. It wasn't a marriage, he reportedly told a close friend. It was a press release with a tuxedo. Vincente Minnelli and Judy Garland's 1945 union arrived wrapped in the language of perfect symmetry. The brilliant filmmaker and the transcendent performer coming together in a match that fan magazines couldn't stop writing about, and MGM executives apparently saw the whole thing in far less poetic terms. Minnelli was widely understood within industry circles to be gay or bisexual, a reality never confirmed publicly during his lifetime, but treated as common knowledge among those who mattered. Garland, by that point, was already deep in the addiction crisis that MGM had helped create, having kept her on amphetamines and barbiturates since childhood to sustain the brutal work schedule the studio demanded. What Carson's sources described was a classic MGM efficiency play. 2 problems solved with 1 marriage. Minnelli needed protection for his reputation, and Garland needed someone stable and disciplined enough to provide the studio with some confidence that their troubled star wouldn't collapse entirely. The painful complication in their story, the thing that separates it from the coldest arrangements on this list, is that genuine affection appears to have existed between them. Liza Minnelli was born from that union, and she would carry both her parents' extraordinary talent and something of their heartbreak into her own life. But the foundation couldn't hold the weight of Garland's escalating struggles, and the marriage dissolved in 1951 after 6 years. Carson reportedly described it with the kind of quiet precision he was known for in private. Hollywood's brightest star, he allegedly said, married a man she could never fully reach. And then he noted the detail that lingered longest, which was that Liza would later unknowingly repeat the pattern by marrying Peter Allen, a gay man, demonstrating how the cycles of deception set in motion by studios could echo and compound across generations without anyone intending them to. Cary Grant had been managing rumors about his sexuality for the better part of 4 decades by the time he married. First, Dean Cannon in 1965, and the sophistication of his approach to that management was something Carson apparently found worthy of particular attention. The rumors had followed Grant since his 12-year domestic arrangement with fellow actor Randolph Scott, the 2 of them sharing a home together in ways that raised eyebrows even in an era not inclined to ask direct questions. Grant had married 3 times before Cannon, and according to Carson's sources, each marriage had arrived at a moment when the whispers had reached a volume requiring a visible public response. Carson allegedly told a longtime associate that Grant had carefully selected women who enhanced his image at precisely the moments he needed them most, calling it Hollywood's most elaborate ongoing smokescreen. What made the Cannon marriage different, and what gives the story a genuinely sad dimension, was that Cannon appeared to love him sincerely. Young, vivid, and apparently entirely in earnest, she entered the marriage without the detachment that might have protected her from what followed. Their daughter Jennifer was born from the union, but the marriage deteriorated quickly, and during divorce proceedings, Cannon described controlling behavior, emotional distance, and a coldness that bore no resemblance to the effortless charm Grant projected on screen. 2 years after the wedding, they separated, and the divorce dragged on and stayed ugly. Carson, who had hosted Grant multiple times and knew him in the particular way that a host comes to know a frequent guest, reportedly made the observation that sat with people longest. Grant had spent so many decades performing the character of Cary Grant, he allegedly said that the line between the performance and the actual man had permanently dissolved, and even Grant himself could no longer find where one ended and the other began. Mickey Rooney was the biggest box office draw in Hollywood in 1942, riding the wholesome Andy Hardy franchise to a level of commercial dominance that made him extraordinarily valuable and made his behavior a constant source of anxiety for the people managing that value. Ava Gardner was 19 years old, breathtaking, under tight MGM contract, and still waiting for anyone to notice what she was actually capable of. According to Carson's sources, Louis B. Mayer personally engineered their marriage, identifying Rooney's womanizing as a liability threatening his squeaky clean image, and Gardner as the convenient solution, young enough to control and gorgeous enough to make the arrangement convincing. For Gardner, the marriage turned into a nightmare almost immediately. Rooney cheated constantly and, according to her later accounts, without any apparent interest in concealment. She had been maneuvered into the arrangement before she understood enough about how the system worked to protect herself, and the studio that had placed her there simply watched. 16 months after it began, Gardner filed for divorce. And MGM immediately pivoted to marketing her sexuality as her primary commercial asset, capitalizing on the same qualities they had just used her supposed marriage to obscure. Carson reportedly described the whole arrangement at a private dinner with the blunt economy that defined his private observations. The two of them, he allegedly said, looked like a Hollywood couple from two entirely different movies. Bea Benaderet was not a conventional movie star, which is precisely why the arrangement she reportedly maintained with actor Jim Bannon operated so successfully for so long. Famous in radio circles and later beloved as a television actress on Petticoat Junction and as the original voice of Betty Rubble on The Flintstones, Benaderet lacked the kind of fame that attracted the scrutiny that unraveled other arrangements. Bannon was a journeyman Western actor with a solid but unspectacular profile. Their 1938 marriage generated almost no press attention and produced 2 children. And according to Carson's sources, it was in its quiet way one of the most completely effective marriages of convenience in Hollywood history. The arrangement worked, Carson allegedly explained, precisely because neither party was famous enough to attract dangerous attention. Close friends of the couple reportedly described a relationship in which both maintained essentially separate lives within a shared domestic structure, each pursuing their own interests while presenting a united front to studio, executives, and the press. Unlike the arrangements on this list where one partner was clearly being used by the other, this one apparently operated as a genuine mutual agreement, a friendship that served both parties more effectively than any authentic romance might have. Carson called it a marriage of microphones rather than hearts, and when the divorce came in 1950, it barely registered anywhere. Both continued to successful careers, and the whole arrangement was notable primarily for how completely it avoided the painful exposure that destroyed so many other Hollywood fictions. Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor's 1939 marriage was, according to Carson's sources, the purest example on his entire list of what the industry called a lavender marriage, a union built from the ground up to suppress rumors about a star's sexuality rather than to reflect any authentic feeling between two people. Taylor's situation had become what a former Tonight Show writer described as Hollywood's worst-kept secret, and Louis B. Mayer had reportedly made the stakes unmistakable in a direct conversation. Marry a woman and make her a star, or watch everything disappear. Stanwyck brought her own calculation to the arrangement. Approaching 35 in an industry that treated female aging as professional decline, marriage to one of Hollywood's most handsome men served her image and her career in ways that outweighed whatever personal cost came with it. Carson allegedly described the whole structure as a business merger with wedding rings, and what made it genuinely worth noting was the professionalism both stars brought to maintaining the performance. Every required industry function, every interview, every domestic photograph for the fan magazines, all of it was executed with the discipline of 2 performers who understood exactly what the job demanded. Carson allegedly told an associate that they kissed on the red carpet and shook hands at home, and that sustaining that particular split across 13 years required more consistent effort than most of their films. The divorce finally came in 1952, managed carefully by publicists who attributed the split to busy schedules and said nothing more revealing than that. As Carson reportedly put it to a friend years later, they were both trapped by the era they lived in, and in any other time, each of them might have lived something closer to an honest life. Janet Leigh and Tony Curtis occupied a particular position in 1950s fan culture as the absolute ideal of what a Hollywood couple was supposed to look like, both of them stunning, both wildly popular, appearing in films together, raising 2 daughters, including Jamie Lee Curtis, and gracing magazine covers with the kind of effortless glamour that seemed to validate the whole myth of Hollywood romance. Universal Studios, according to Carson's sources, was heavily involved in constructing the relationship from the beginning. Curtis's bachelor lifestyle had been, first, generating the wrong kind of attention at precisely the moment his career was ascending, and executives reportedly gave him a short list of acceptable women he might consider marrying. Leah came recommended as someone whose own career would benefit from the association, elevating her from secondary roles to the kind of A-list consideration she had been working toward. What began as mutual career strategy eventually produced something that looked, at least from the outside, like genuine affection, but according to those close to the couple, it never resembled the passionate romance described in print. Curtis's persistent infidelity ran through the marriage like a fault line, and Leah later told Carson, according to a former colleague, that reading descriptions of her perfect marriage in fan magazines left her genuinely struggling to recognize whose life was being described. After 11 years, the marriage ended in 1962, with Curtis almost immediately marrying his most recent co-star, and Leah later admitted to feeling blindsided by the collapse in ways that suggested plotch. The studio narrative had grown so pervasive that she had partly come to believe it herself. Carson's alleged summary of the whole affair carried the particular sting of accuracy. America bought the illusion, he reportedly said. She bought the heartbreak. Loretta Young's 1940 marriage to radio producer Tom Lewis looked, from the outside, like a Hollywood star finding stability with a successful behind-the-scenes figure, and they stayed married for 29 years and raised 2 sons together, which made it one of the longer-lasting unions on Carson's entire list. The story beneath that surface, though, began 5 years earlier, in 1935, when Young and Clark Gable co-starred in The Call of the Wild. Gable was married at the time. Young became pregnant, and in an era when that combination of facts would have ended her career immediately and permanently, she responded with a campaign of concealment that Carson's sources described as the most calculated arrangement in Hollywood history. Young vanished from public view, gave birth in secret, placed her own biological daughter through a Catholic orphanage, and then quietly reclaimed the child and raised her as an adoptee, constructing a fiction that would require decades of consistent maintenance to sustain. Lewis, according to Carson's sources, understood the role he was agreeing to play, and the career opportunities that came with being attached to a major star made the arrangement attractive enough for him to accept its terms. The marriage was described by those close to the couple as cold and businesslike, with Young maintaining tight control over every aspect of their public image. When the divorce came in 1969, few people in the industry were surprised. The arrangement had served its purpose and run its course. Young never publicly acknowledged that Judy Lewis was her biological daughter with Gable, carrying that particular truth. All the way to her death, and it wasn't until 1994, when Judy Lewis published her memoir, that the full story finally reached the public. Carson's alleged observation about Young was the one that people who heard it tended to remember longest. The greatest performance Loretta Young ever gave, he reportedly said, wasn't in any movie. It was the 40-year performance as a woman with nothing to hide. Henry Fonda's entry on Carson's list is the one most stripped of glamour, the most nakedly transactional in its apparent motivations on both sides. When Fonda married 21-year-old Susan Blanchard in 1950, he was 46 and carrying the weight of a previous marriage that had ended in catastrophe. His wife Frances Seymour had died by suicide, and the circumstances surrounding that marriage had left his public image severely damaged, with the studio growing anxious about how audiences were beginning to see him. The solution they pushed for was quick remarriage to someone young enough and uncomplicated enough to signal fresh stability without introducing new problems. Blanchard, working as a secretary in Fonda's professional circle, fit every requirement. Carson allegedly described the arrangement with the sadness of someone who had heard too many versions of the same story. Fonda needed a wife for his image, a longtime associate recalled him saying, and she needed to escape her own circumstances, and neither of them was actually getting what they wanted. Less than 3 years later, the marriage was over. The telling detail, according to Carson's sources, was that when Fonda discussed his life in his later years, he would move directly from his marriage to Frances Seymour to his final marriage to Afdura Franchetti, as if the years with Blanchard had been an uncomfortable intermission too awkward to acknowledge. Carson's alleged summary of the brief union was characteristically precise. "They said I do," he reportedly told a friend, and quickly understood they shouldn't have. Joan Crawford's marriage to Franchot Tone in 1935 was, according to Carson's sources, the system operating at its most coldly efficient, and what makes it worth examining carefully is how clearly it reveals the particular anxiety driving Crawford's decisions at that point in her career. Despite enormous commercial success, Crawford carried a deep unease about her cultural standing, sensitive about her lack of formal education and her origins in silent films, which certain industry figures treated as a mark of lesser prestige than stage work. Tone arrived carrying everything she wanted access to: a Princeton education, a background in prestigious theatrical circles, and relationships with the kind of people Crawford was determined to know. She pursued the marriage, according to Carson's sources, with the same strategic calculation she applied to every career decision. Tone, for his part, apparently fell genuinely in love, entering the arrangement without understanding that. First, he was functioning primarily as a social credential, and that once Crawford had gained access to everything he represented, her interest in him specifically would cool accordingly. Carson quoted a former colleague of Tone's who described being married to Crawford as being married to a corporation that had decided you were no longer a valuable asset, and by all accounts Tone never fully recovered from the experience. Problems with alcohol followed him for years after the marriage ended, while Crawford moved efficiently to her next strategic arrangement. 4 years was all the marriage lasted, and when it ended, Tone was left with the wreckage while Crawford was already calculating the next move. Carson's alleged observation on the whole affair was as direct as anything attributed to him. "Tone gave her prestige," he reportedly said. "She gave him pain." What Carson's alleged private list reveals, taken as a whole, goes beyond the individual cynicism of each arrangement. It reveals the human cost of a system that treated authentic lives as inconveniences to be managed, that converted real people into instruments of commercial machinery, and that left behind it a trail of damage stretching far beyond the principal names in each story. The children raised in houses built on secrets, sensing something profoundly wrong without ever being given the language to name it. The civilian spouses who entered arrangements they may not have fully understood and found themselves permanently, first, defined by the role they were handed. And the stars themselves, some of whom spent so many decades performing their public selves that they eventually lost whatever thread connected them to who they actually were underneath all of it. Carson was not a man given to sentimentality, and the observations attributed to him carry the characteristic sharpness of someone who had watched the whole machine running for 30 years from a very good seat. But, according to those present for these conversations, he returned again and again to the same point. The gilded cage, he reportedly said, is still a cage. The smiles were real. The pain behind them was real. The only fiction was the story America was being sold, and America, hungry for something to believe in, bought every last word of it.